I am now back to volume 2 from the Rich and Poor, Esmerce Austin book, which can be found on Amazon. So this is the second reading, and it's about my grandfather, who's that's Mercer's father. So let me begin, and I will have to explain what I'm going to read. This book is written by a Jamaican, so I'm going to read it in the Jamaican dialect, which is the patois, and then I'm going to explain what it means if you are not Jamaican and you're listening to it. Teacher, me will pay you for not teach them ya Craig Pickney, so them pass exam. Who a go come and walk on me ground for me if you make them pass? Those were Ernest Austin words in Jamaican Creole. Translated in English, he asked the new principal of the all-age school not to teach the children to become successful citizens, as when they pass exams, they will no longer want to work on his farm. Ernest, Mercer's father, was a selfish and self-centered man with a lot of wealth and power. When teacher Wilbur Brown, which was the principal of the primary school, first went to Craighead All-Age School, as a young principal teacher, Ernest, who was very influential in the district, went to him and tried to bribe him with money not to educate the children, so that he could have them work on his farm for pennies, so that he could continue to build his wealth. Now, Teacher Brown's mission was to teach, and he did not like the request, so he chased him away. Now, this new principal, young man, came to the district. He wanted a reputation for himself, so he wanted to build the school so that, you know, the school would have a good reputation. But instead, my grandfather, Ernest Austin, because he had the most money in the area, he thought he could bribe him not to teach the kids. He should just go there and sit and collect the government money and do nothing. But the principal felt insulted and hurt, so he chased him away. Mercer wanted to give his father the benefit of the doubt, which Mercer is my father, and he would usually blame his wife Maud for Ernest's coldness towards him. Now, my father would always blame his stepmother, that his stepmother was the one who was treating him with that coldness, instead of blaming his father, because he just could not believe that his father would be so cold towards him. Maybe Ernest would have been a better man and father, but he signed on with the devil when he married Maud Palmer Austin. Maud was Arabella's first cousin, and Arabella was my grandmother, my mother's mother. It's my maternal grandmother, first cousin, and Mercer's wife Esme, second cousin. So my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was married to my maternal grandmother cousin. Mercer, my father, was a very proud man. Responsibility was entrusted on him from a very young age. His mother kept breeding illegitimate children, and I say breeding illegitimate children, as fast as she could, and he, being the first son, had to work to help support them. Poor Mercer. Only once in Mercer's life had he asked his father for assistance. He asked his father to buy him what we call a cap, which is a hat, when he was a boy, and Maud, the wife, replied by saying Ernest did not have the money. At the same time, they were counting money from the profits they received at the market, and he knew they really had the money for the hat. And then those days a hat was very cheap, maybe a couple of pennies. Not only that, but they were in the marketplace where the hat was being sold. He had accompanied them to the market, worked tirelessly to please them, and his request was denied. Even though he was still a child, he vowed that he would never ask his father for any more assistance, and he never did. That one incident made him a man. He grew up right away, and he made the decision never to ask his father for anything again. Ernest was a Caucasian man. His descendants were Scottish. His parents were planting overseers. They were hired by the owner to run the plantation and make sure everything got done. His mother was in charge of the women and his father in charge of the men. All discipline was bestowed on the slaves by his parents. Slavery was abolished when Ernest was a very young child. But there were a lot of ex-slaves that worked on the farms and were treated terribly. One thing that could be said about Ernest is that he did not have issues with the color of one's skin. His greatest love experiences were with very dark-skinned women. He himself was born as an illegitimate child of one of the plantation overseer. The relationship between Ernest's mother and father lasted only for a short while. She wasn't going to raise Ernest as a single parent, so she marries Mr. Cohen, another plantation owner who was also Scottish. Like Mercer, Ernest was from a place called Allside, Trelawney. Some of his older legitimate children were also born at Allsides, Trelawney. Maud, Ernest's wife, was as ugly as sin, yet he loved her with every passion of his being. His family turned their backs on him when he loved black women. He was married to a black woman, Maud, was very dark-skinned. He was a man with a head for business and wealth. In the village of Craighead alone, he acquired 36 acres of land. This land stretches from the roadside of Craighead to the Hector's River and beyond. The river that divides Manchester from Trelawney. In addition to this, there were also a lot of land in Trelawney that he walked away from, as there were more than enough farmland in Manchester to manage. Ernest was not only smart, but he was unscrupulous. His acquisition of the land was merely due to his devious maneuver of the desperate and less fortunate villagers. He had the money available, and in those days, when people borrowed money on their land, it used to be from a private investor and not the bank. If the borrower forfeited on the loan, then the land would be sold off. Ernest was called in on a lot of these deals, and he purchased all the surrounding lands as they became available. Maud was very controlling. That's his wife. And she made sure the children knew that. The only two children they could not control was one called Miss B, which was Valda. And she was married, she was Valda, Mabel, and Austin, which she got married by the name of Malcolm. And she was married to Kenneth Aguila Malcolm from Christiana and Mercel, and they both hated that. The children that did not listen and weren't blasted against Mercer were B, which is Valda, and Son, which is Guy, Sarah, Vincent, Jemima, Eugenia, that lived in Kingston, divorced themselves. Then they have two, Jemima and Eugene, that lived in Kingston, which divorced themselves from their parents even before some of Mercer's children were born, because they didn't really like the attitudes of their parents, which were selfish and cruel. So they just went their separate ways, and they didn't really go back and check their parents. Vita, which is one of the daughters that still lived in the area, she loved Mercer, and she showed her love, but she was still fearful of the wrath of Ernest and Maud. Mercer appreciated her acceptance and wrath towards him and loved her just as much in return. Sarah was not cold. Sarah was hot and cold, I should say. Yet they still were able to manage and maintain a cordial relationship. B was wonderful, close to Mercer. She and her husband Kenneth were the rocks he leaned on whenever he needed anything, such as a loan or even advice on how to proceed with certain decisions. Guy loved him also, but lived in England and moved to St. Thomas after returning to Jamaica. He brought his wife home, and he made sure he moved away and lived very far from them, so that they could not interfere in he and his wife's life. Vincent lived in England, and when he moved back to Jamaica, he lived a few minutes from their house and never visited. He was displeased with them when he returned and discovered that the land he sent his money to buy was in their names, and they refused to change the title to his name. Then there were the other two, Aileen and Iris. Iris and Aileen stayed at home in anticipation that they would be the ones to inherit their father's wealth. At the drop of a hat, they found every reason to humiliate the other brothers and sisters, and it worked. They all chose to stay away. They were the younger versions of Maud. They were as terrible and hateful as their mother, Maud. They were repulsive. They hated people for prospering, and they hated others that weren't so prosperous. They hated simply because they breathed the same air. Can you imagine that? Their souls were dark and bitter. They weren't like the devil. They were the devil themselves. They would buy a whole reel of cloth and make one dress from it, as they did not want anyone else to have clothes from the same material. Some of the grandchildren from Ernest and Maud were very successful, but they never visited their grandparents' home, and one could only assume that because of their control and hatred, the grandchildren stayed away from them. One of such grandchildren was Madge Sinclair, the actress from Roots, Trapper John M.D., Steve Harvey's show. At the time of her death, she was acting on a popular network sitcom as the grandmother in the Steve Harvey show. Madge's mother sent her and her sister to spend the summer with her grandparents in Craighead, and while sleeping in the morning, Aileen looked through the window and remarked, "Where did my sister find this man from to have such ugly children with him?" She was speaking about Madge's father. Madge went back to Kingston, told her mother about Aileen's remark, and the mother never sent the children back to Craighead nor visited her parents again. Even when Madge became famous, she never made mention of them. In a very subtle way, they tried to harm Mercer's kids, whereby trying to give them bad luck, or so they thought. Maud, Iris, and Aileen knew that Mercer's children had to walk alongside their home. There was a pathway there to get to Sodom for lunch every day, and during exam time, they would burn things at the side of the road as a bad omen. It worked, yes it did, but in a progressive way. The more they burned, the more progressive the children became. Ernest was supposedly a Christian. He sat in church at a special bench on Sundays, the same aisle as Mercer's children, and never once asked any of them how they were doing. He looked straight at them and through them. This is important to know that Mercer lived in the same village as his father. Both his home and his father Ernest's home were just a few minutes walking distance from each other. One of Mercer's young sons was traveling to Sodom on the Sodom Road, which leads to my maternal grandmother's home. Alongside Ernest's home, and the pail that Iris' pig was feeding from rolled over in the road, and Iris called to her nephew and said, "Little boy, hand me that pail." The son, which is my brother, who must have been about 8 or 9 years old, replied to her, "Come and take it yourself." He just walked on. The first thing was that she either did not know his name or she did not want to call him by his name. Secondly, The son, my brother, knew that they hated his parents so much that he would not get into trouble if he did not show her any respect. So he hissed his teeth and moved on. It's very unfortunate that the two families lived in the same district and yet did not get to know one another. Mercer's children never once stepped on the property of their grandfather. By the 1970s, Mercer had gotten a lot older and had reached a point in his life as a Christian where he could no longer hold a grudge against the same people who fought him and his children successes in life. Also, Maud, the evil mother-in-law, had died. His sisters saw how well the children had turned out and were more than amazed that in spite of their convincing ways, the children were happy and prosperous. They gave up fighting, and his sisters, Irish and Aileen, made peace with him. Peace with the children were a bit more difficult, as they could not understand why there were so many malice and hatred shown to them when they were so young and innocent. Aileen lived a long life, and in her later years, one of Mercer's child became her closest caregiver. She died December of 2015. Ernest died in 1974 from coronary thrombosis. So this is the second series that I have read, and I will continue to read the entire series until I have completed the book. So this is it for today. I hope you will enjoy this series, and thanks for reading.